So we had geology, now we're going to have archaeology. And so we're so delighted to have Dr. Jess Robinson here. He's the Vermont State archaeologist, the second one ever, and he has a great affinity for Mount Independence and has crawled all over it and has done great studies about here, and he knows a lot about the whole history of and the archaeology of Vermont, and especially the Champlain Valley. And he's very busy, so we're really pleased that you can come today. Thank you so much, Jess.
Well, thanks, Elsa, and I really appreciate being here, and I really appreciate the previous talk, and Helen's discussion was amazing, and a great compliment to what we're about to talk about. And I am not a Revolutionary War historian or historic archaeologist by training. I've had to learn a lot of that since getting on the job here, although I did do some work here at Chimney Point prior. So I will concentrate on what I thought might complement the experts in the room, which is the pre-contact or prehistoric archaeology of the Champlain Valley, and try to focus on Mount Independence where I can. And one of those areas where I will in the latter half of the talk be sort of referencing Mount Independence is precisely what one of the folks talked about, which is the chert that outcrops here and elsewhere. And I'm glad that you're still here, because please jump in and correct me or add to whatever I'm about to say. But I heard you might sneak out, so as a prelude, before I even show anything, I will say that the chert on the mount is what is called a nodular chert, meaning that the silica flows through the limestone and then gets trapped in cavities there. And over a long period of time, those cavities fill with silica-rich solution, and then they solidify. And the processes by which they solidify, I guess heat and pressure and time, and they become these nodules. And the nodules can be, I've seen nodules that are, football size or smaller, and nodules can be huge, the size of Volkswagens or bigger. But they're solution that was trapped in cavities. And there's a major quarry of that on Mount Independence. We don't know how big it once was, largely because it was mined for at least the last probably 10,000, 9,500 years by Native Americans. And then it was mined during the Revolutionary War for gun flints. And so what the original extent of the outcrops and the quality of the stone was, we don't know. It is not the only place where this chert outcrops. Geologically very similar outcrops that were formed through the same processes occur in Whitehall and in Fort Anne. And archaeologists, not being geologists, call them all different cherts, and it's taken a long time to realize that they're essentially just different outcrops of the same chert. But then there's another chert. There's only two outcrops of really well-known chert in Vermont. There's another outcrop of this stuff at Mount Independence up towards Charlotte too, but it's smaller. We don't know how much Native Americans actually utilized it. And they were probably finding smaller little microbeds of chert throughout the Champlain Valley. But we don't know of any big quarries other than Mount Independence in Vermont. And then there's another one up in St. Albans called Hathaway Chert, near and around Hathaway Point, which was formed by a completely different process, and is geologically very similar to the major Native American chert quarries down in the Hudson Valley, and was formed during the Taconic orogeny, which I have no idea what that is.
That was those volcanoes?
Right.
When those collided, that was the Taconic orogeny.
Yes. So all the Hudson Valley quarries were formed during the Taconic orogeny, as was this St. Albans quarry. But the St. Albans quarry then underwent a lot of deformation, and then so the chert got all cracked up and then was sort of solidified together. So it's what geologists, I understand, call a melange. the chert looks quite different, it feels quite different, and it underwent significant, it was used in different ways by Native Americans. And so I'm going to talk about that in a little in the second half of my talk. The first half of my talk, though, I will be focusing on the other thing that was mentioned, which is the end of the last ice age, when the glaciers had receded north of what's Vermont, and right around 14,000 years ago, and the events that would come to be the first landscape that humans entered into Vermont was pertinent. And we call this earliest period of native or human habitation in Vermont the Paleo-Indian period. In the Northeast, it dates from roughly 13,000 to about 9,500 years ago. And this is just there we go. This is just an artist's reconstruction of what it would have looked like at the height of the last pulse of the last ice age, probably around 24,000 years ago. This up here, you can see, is sort of the Nova Scotia area. The continental shelf was largely exposed, but covered in ice down to roughly Long Island. And again, this mile of ice overlay, in some cases, the region that we're on now. But it began to melt, and this would be the last melt. The previous ice age had gone through pulses of melting and retreating ice, and this would be the last for this particular ice age. This is what just another more simplistic illustration would have looked like. The large ice sheet covering what's now much of northeastern North America, the Laurentide ice sheet, and then a Pacific ice sheet called the Cordilleran. And locally, right around 13,500 years ago or so, rounding, this is what the newly exposed landscape looked like. All this meltwater was filling the major basins in the New England region and in the Great Lakes region. In the Champlain Valley, there was a huge glacial lake called Lake Vermont, which at its height was actually confluent with another glacial lake called Glacial Lake Albany, essentially forming one giant lake at its largest extent. In the Connecticut River Valley, there was Glacial Lake Hitchcock, and then in the Great Lakes Basin, there was an enormous glacial lake called Glacial Lake Iroquois. And right around 13,300 years ago, that sort of nick point between Glacial Lake Iroquois and Lake Vermont, Lake Albany, gave way, and there was a catastrophic flood that sent water down the valley, blew out Lake Vermont, Lake Albany, all the way out through Long Island Sound. If I was giving a longer lecture just on the Paleo-Indian period, I'd have a lot more slides, but basically that emptied out, a couple hundred feet of Lake Iroquois, Lake Vermont, all the way down, drained. And my colleague Stephen Wright, once said, well, imagine sitting on top of Mount Philo and watching, Lake Champlain drain 100 feet in a matter of days. That would be what it would have looked like to have been there. Then Lake Vermont actually reformed, but with a shorter dam around Whitehall again, filled again, with, again, melting glacial meltwater. And then finally, around 13,000 years ago, the glacier that was holding seawater away from the glacial water gave way, and Lake Vermont drained again out of the Atlantic. But as was noted before, the lowlands of the Champlain Valley, because of isostatic rebound, or isostatic pressure, were compressed. So a lot of that low-lying area was lower than the Atlantic Ocean. Seawater ran in, and that began the tenure of the Champlain Sea, and right around 13,000 years ago. And the Champlain Sea was in existence, although getting slowly shallower through time as isostatic rebound and sea level changes globally slowly caused the land to rebound again, seawater change to happen, until finally it became a freshwater lake around 9,500, 9,000 years ago. So this is what the area would have looked like around 11,800 years ago, just in the middle of the Champlain Sea period. This was the southern arm of the Champlain Valley. The Champlain Sea at its maximum went into the Ontario lowlands and then out into the Atlantic, and then portions of the continental shelf were still exposed. And what we're interested in here is the southern arm, the Champlain Valley, Vermont and New York. And unlike the glacial lakes, which had very little organic or biotic activity in them, the Champlain Sea, as was noted, was filled with marine life. It's much like off the coast of Labrador today. There were marine mammals, which I'll show in a minute. There were fish. There were mollusks. There was a lot of microscopic marine life. It was just a thriving cold water marine environment. Just pictures of what it might look like. And for a paper I did a number of years ago, I aggregated what were then all of the radiocarbon dates of marine mammals that have been found in the Champlain Sea. So I'll just read them through here. Harbor seal, bowhead whale, finback whale, ringed seal, white whale, narwhal, walrus. All of these have been found in Champlain Sea sediments. And the dates attest to other geological indicators that suggest the Champlain Sea started right around 13,000 years ago and went right until about 10,000 or a little later. Recently, the Charlotte whale, the state marine fossil, was actually radiocarbon dated to just almost exactly 13,000 years ago. So was probably there just at the start of the Champlain Sea. So getting back to what I'm more familiar with, which is native people and archaeology. The start of the arrival of the Champlain Sea also coincided regionally with the start of humans entering the region, the Paleo-Indian people. And if you're not familiar with the native archaeology of this region, you were thinking just sort of casually or simplistically about it, you might think that these earliest people were had the most quote unquote simplistic or quote unquote primitive technologies, but that's actually not the case, at least when it comes to stone. Native Paleo-Indians in the Northeast and elsewhere in the continent actually were master craftsmen in stone, and it's particularly evinced in their spear points, which were often quite large, expertly what we call napped or flaked to a really uniform shape and morphology. And then once they achieved this shape with this often ribbon-type flaking going down it, they would take this central channel off of the middle of the point on both sides typically. This flute or channel is a hallmark of the Paleo-Indian period, not only in the Northeast, but actually everywhere across much of the continent, from middle of Central America all the way up to the glacial ice sheet in Washington State or Nova Scotia, and across the continent. It's the only time that we're aware of that native people did the same thing, made the same stone tool from one end of the continent to the other. And typical reconstructions of Paleo-Indian lifeways, again across the continent and here in the Northeast in previous decades, have imagined them as sort of peripatetic wanderers, hunting out big game. This is what a typical, late 70s depiction of northeastern Paleo-Indians was drawn as. Wearing out on the cold tundra, wearing caribou skins and hunting caribou, relying on these large terrestrial animals. If not caribou, then perhaps bison. If not bison, then perhaps mastodon or mammoth. By the way, this particular spear point was made for me I had a reconstruction made of it at Chimney Point, I wanted it precisely so I could show this last reduction sequence. So I kept the last channel flake. And that chert is Hudson Valley chert from West Athens Hill. So, as I was saying, as geologists were coming to understand the age of the Champlain Sea, which is not a long ago thing. It's really only in the last 15 years or so that people have gotten, through various techniques, gotten a suite of accepted radiocarbon dates to understand exactly the age of the Champlain Sea. And in previous decades, archaeologists became convinced that the Champlain Sea had already come and gone by the time the first humans had come in. So essentially they were coming into the lake more or less as it exists today. But now we know that's not the case. And conversely, on the right of this, you'll see all of the northeastern Paleo-Indian radiocarbon dates. There have been no radiocarbon dated Paleo-Indian sites in Vermont, but in neighboring states, we've developed a chronology and how spear points, even though they were these fluted spear points, changed through time throughout the Paleo-Indian period. And that's illustrated up top by Vermont spear points. So understanding this, that the age of the Champlain Sea, about 15 years ago now, 20 years ago now, was revised more recent, that it was potentially or was coeval with the Paleo-Indian period. My colleague John Kroc and I were interested in if Paleo-Indians were even attracted to the Champlain Sea. Was it a reason to be here? Was it something that they thought about? Or were they more content to be walking out on the frozen terrain, hunting terrestrial mammals? And it was at best an impediment to get where they needed to be. So we began a large survey of Paleo-Indian sites, those that had been officially recorded in Vermont, but also those that were still in farmers' collections and elsewhere, and went about a couple of year period documenting these sites and mapping their locations and relevant information about the sites on various maps, which I've added to over the years. So based upon the styles of spear point that change through time, we can roughly bracket the ages within the Paleo-Indian period. And the first, based upon this style of spear point, dates from about 12,900 to about 12,400 years ago. And I contend that people probably didn't move into the Champlain Valley in any real way until about 12,700 years ago, for various reasons, but a lot of it having to do with plant cover and the enough biomass for people and animals to live in. Because obviously when the glaciers receded, it takes time for pollen to spread north, for plants to start growing, for rivers to cut into their banks and to be stable enough to support a human population, however small. So this is a close-up with a LiDAR underlying a map of the Champlain Sea at its maximum, and I worked with George Springston, from a Norwich geologist, who did the fine mapping of the Champlain Sea at its maximum. We published a paper together a number of years ago, and this is his map, and the heat map is just relative elevation. So higher elevation is in the grays, and what you see is there's this cluster of Paleo-Indian sites at the area where the Champlain Sea met the Winooski River. So the Winooski River was bigger than it is today. As you can see, it was probably somewhat estuarine-like, and where it flowed in, you have this concentration of Paleo-Indian sites. This is roughly where the box stores in Williston are today. And the biggest Paleo-Indian site yet known in Vermont is down here on this sort of tributary running out into the shallow water, perhaps tidal flat type feature. Just a close-up of that area. And in the 1990s, when it was excavated by the University of Vermont Consulting Archaeology Program, they were really stumped about why a Paleo-Indian site, let alone, it's huge, would be on this sort of exposed bedrock knoll, nowhere really near any notable features. But now we know that it was on this trib running out into these lower areas, out into the sea, was in a really advantageous position, to encounter game going out to the sea, to take advantage of the resources of the sea itself.
So was that Williston?
Williston, yes. So, I'll get back to this in a minute, but at this site in Williston, we have raw material that Paleo-Indians were using that span roughly 850 kilometers in straight line distance between the most distant quarries. We have local quartzite that outcrops principally along the western spine of the Green Mountains, but there's a lot of boulders and cobbles of it all throughout the Champlain Valley. The top two rows are that Hudson Valley chert around the Albany area. This red material down on the bottom left is from Monsungan Lake in north central Maine. And then that yellow material down on the lower right is actually from a quarry in central Pennsylvania. So all of this material was transported either by direct movement of Paleo-Indians or potentially by trade and exchange over a vast distance. The next period, we have a very large Paleo-Indian site where, very similar to the Winooski, where the Lamoille was flowing out into the Champlain Sea, again attesting to the importance of that sort of freshwater to seawater locale. And again, variety of materials, Mount Jasper rhyolite from Berlin, New Hampshire, and then some more Monsungan Lake chert. Another area down in Ferrisburg, near here, on what would have been sort of an island landform. You can see that spear point up there. And then another one just across on what would have been a peninsula. And again, these are approximate because we could only map the Champlain Sea precisely at its maximum. So through time, the Champlain Sea is getting shallower, and perhaps things were only underwater at high tide, or at king tides, or it becomes a little bit approximate. So these aren't perfectly drawn lines because things were in flux through time, but you can get a general proximity to the Champlain Sea. The Reagan site in the next following subperiod, again on an island-like landform up in East Highgate. And I did my master's principally on that site, and the landowner at the time told me he was burying a huge boulder that was in his lawn that he just found unsightly, and he borrowed a backhoe and was digging a huge hole in his lawn just because he wanted to roll the boulder and then cover it over. And he said when he got about 8 feet down, it was just nothing but shell, just a huge shell bed from the Champlain Sea. The next subperiod, and then the final subperiod, you can finally begin to see that now these dots are encroaching upon the margins of the Champlain Sea, because the Champlain Sea is getting shallower. It's becoming, probably at this point, it's probably brackish, becoming on its way to becoming fresh, and that land was becoming exposed. And so the only thing that's probably still too dynamic to live on are the accumulating river deltas, the Missisquoi Delta, the Winooski Delta, and the Lamoille Delta. And everything else was probably habitable, and we saw people moving out onto those landforms. So, in aggregate, we see a very close correspondence between Paleo-Indian sites and the Champlain Sea. We also see Paleo-Indian sites on near glacially formed ponds and lakes, Bristol Pond, Moncton Pond, Lake Salem, Shelburne Pond, which would have probably been important sources of fresh water, perhaps areas of emergent sort of wetland or muskeg-like environments that would have been important places for waterfowl or for different kinds of animals. And then finally, we see Paleo-Indian sites and travel corridors. And toward that end, we're very limited in what we can study about the Paleo-Indian period. It's principally, except for the very rarest discoveries of bone throughout the region, the only thing that is left is stone, and so we're limited in what we can study and how we can study it. And archaeologists are pretty clever in figuring some things out, and one of them was that, well, we know where the sources of this stone have come from. We've tested this a variety of different ways using a lot of petrographic and chemical analyses. And so we can ask the computer through GIS modeling, what would be the best way, for instance, to get from the Mahan in Williston to one of these quarries, and let's say the Munsungan Lake Quarry in Maine. So my colleagues John and Weatherby and I ran what's called a weighted cost surface analysis using a lot of different factors, one being slope, but a lot of different ones, and said to this program, well, what would be the easiest way, giving all those parameters, for one to get from the Mahan site in Williston to the Munsungan Lake Chert Quarry in Maine. And there is an interior route that was sort of highlighted in green, but by far the easiest route would have been along the Champlain Sea itself, up into what's now southern Quebec, and then taking what is now the Etchemin River into the West Branch of Penobscot, and then to Munsungan Lake. And what that said to us was that it looks like Paleo-Indians are probably utilizing the resources of the Champlain Sea for food. Maybe not whales, but perhaps seals, perhaps fish, perhaps mussels and other things. But they were also using it for transportation. Perhaps they made boats of some kind. Large wood to make canoes would have been very scarce, but you could make hide boats, much like people in the Arctic do today. This is a picture of that. Or conversely, they could have gone on the ice in winter. We know that it's either harbor or ringed seals, of which there's a number of fossil incidences in the Champlain Sea, only rear their pups on landfast ice. Similarly, narwhals really require landfast ice or steady ice as part of their feeding and well-being. So much like Arctic people did today, they might have waited till the winter and crossed by foot, or perhaps used dog sleds or other means of transportation like that. So, summarizing that portion, I would just say that the Vermont and in the Champlain Valley, New York, are really unique testing grounds or laboratories to understand the Paleo-Indian period, because our beaches have been rising since the Paleo-Indian period, since the end of the Champlain Sea, and where not already developed on, and they're prime landforms for development, so a lot of them have been, preserve this beachfront record. Whereas on the Atlantic side, the continental shelf, which we know Paleo-Indians were out doing stuff, has covered by hundreds of feet of water now, making it very, very difficult to study what they were doing, how they were interacting with the sea. So currently, until we developed the next generation of ROVs and drones and things like that, we have this sort of area best suited to studying these early lifeways and how they interacted with their marine environments. So, Archaic period, I've only got 2 slides here. I don't even know where I'm at, but I did want to show the sister site, Chimney Point, right here. And as the Champlain Sea receded, became Lake Champlain like we know it today, we can see that Native people were very rapidly utilizing those newly exposed landforms. The Champlain Sea would have been underwater until the very last stages of, the Chimney Point would have been under water until the very last stages of the Champlain Sea. But very quickly after it gets exposed, we see the next sort of phase that archaeologists identify called the early Archaic. We see sites or evidence of people out there, as early as 9,000 years ago. And they were quickly adapting to the resources of this sort of newly emerging lake and river environment. We see at the Johns Bridge site in Swanton the earliest evidence of fish use, procurement, and probably eating in Vermont around 9,000 years ago, catfish. We see technologies like these fish knives emerging right around the same time. So as fish are repopulating the rivers and the lakes, people are rapidly developing technologies to take advantage of these newfound resources. So I'm going to skip roughly the next 6,000 years or so. This was a time of, that 6,000 year period was the time of hunter-gatherer fishers. The environment became much more stable, although not completely uniform. There are pulses of slightly warmer and slightly colder, slightly wetter, slightly drier periods. But in general, it was a time when native people were becoming increasingly adept at utilizing the myriad resources around them for clothing, for food, for medicine, for transport, and intimately understanding all of the different environmental niches in the state. So, just briefly, the early woodland period around 3,000 to 2,000 years ago begins to see what environmental proxies tell us is a change in the prevailing environmental regime. Archaeologically and geologically, we can see a lot of things, or environmentally, happening around 2,800 years ago across the world. Various cultures go into decline or collapse. There's weird things that are going on environmentally, and people are still trying to understand that. But we see echoes of that happening around this time in eastern North America. In Vermont, populations, which is a very coarse sort of metric, but we see archaeological sites get fewer and the sites themselves get smaller, indicating that, however, approximately population size are probably decreasing. We don't know why. Perhaps people were moving out. Perhaps population, the carrying capacity of the environment was just such that people didn't have as big families, or death was more pronounced. We're not quite sure, but it does seem to be the case, not only in Vermont, but Maine, where I've scrutinized equivalent data, and impressionistically elsewhere in the Northeast. But conversely, we see a rise of the first sort of, huge multi-regional exchange in non-utilitarian goods. So I'm an advocate during the Paleo-Indian period that people probably were exchanging stone as gifts, as a means of solidifying social bonds. Perhaps the stones had special meanings to them, reminded them of different places. Perhaps they were used to honor specific types of game. But that was very probably reciprocal, small scale, and those tools in most cases, or those stones were in most cases turned into tools. Beginning in the around 3,000 years ago, we can see that people were exchanging all sorts of materials that were not meant to be turned into everyday goods. Copper from the Great Lakes and from Nova Scotia that was turned into beads and bracelets and sort of chest plates. Pipestone from various parts of the mid-continent and Ohio Valley that were turned into the first smoking pipes we see in the archaeological record in this region. Galena, or lead ore that was turned into a sort of paint, we think as sort of body adornment or a paint for different sort of sacred items. Lithic materials, but that weren't destined to be your everyday spear point, but that were often made into very, very large ceremonial, what we call hypertrophic or exaggerated blades, some of which come all the way from northern Labrador and Rama Bay. And then shell. that were also turned into various items of adornment from the Gulf Coast and Mid-Atlantic, particularly the Delmarva Peninsula. And elsewhere, we have evidence of fossil shark's teeth, other items being circulated that would have been worn or displayed in some way. And depending upon how you look at the data, I'm a Vermont-centric guy, so you can see that in a certain way, a number of these trade corridors come through the Champlain Valley. A lot of these we see end up as grave goods and Native American burials from this time, which I won't show out of respect to those Native groups. But there's a few that I've come across in recent years from non-burial context. For instance, this sort of ceremonial blade made from, again, Ramachurt in northern Labrador, and you can tell by the shape and the basal morphology that it dates to this early woodland period. That was found along the Missisquoi River in Berkshire, and it's difficult to judge by the scale, but it's like this big, and it's like that wide, and when you hold it up to the light, it's like completely translucent. It's just absolutely remarkable. And this copper axe that was found in the mud of Lake Salem a number of years ago, because it was in an anaerobic environment, is the only copper axe I've ever seen from this time period that's not corroded green with verdigris. It's still much like it was when it was made roughly 2,500 years ago. The early woodland period is also interesting because it's when pottery first began to be made. At first, the pottery in this region, was, which we call Vinette 1, was quite small. Often, the pots were more or less glorified drinking cup size, occasionally bigger, but often like that, and very fragile. So finding this pottery is quite a challenge because a lot of it just eroded and crumbled away. But occasionally we do find it in Vermont. And it's characteristic because it's the only time period where they would take fabric that they had made, pieces of fabric, wrap it around a dowel or perhaps even their hand, and then impress it into both the exterior and the interior sides of the pot. And that's what you're seeing here. This is what we call fabric paddling, this sort of striated impressions. And my late colleague, Charlie Paquin, who some of you might have known, he's what we call an experimental archaeologist, and he did an extended study where he tried to make this Vinette 1 pottery using only the materials and means that Native people would have had 3,000 years ago, with some exceptions. He used 5-gallon buckets to get clay. He wasn't, he wasn't going the full, but he went pretty far. He went farther than I thought he would. And he had a number of revelations that came out of this, principally that it is really hard to make pottery in Vermont. There were no kilns here. This was open fire firing. And so you needed a lot of hardwood. I mean, he said the amount of wood he had to collect, and he didn't chop down trees or use axes. He tried to collect dead wood like they would have usually done. Was just an overwhelming task. Yes, he was doing it alone or occasionally with a helper, but it took him a long time. And what he discovered was you needed that amount of wood to keep the fire burning long enough and hot enough to really solidify the pot. And so the correlation was you weren't ever just going to do this to make one pot. When you were doing it, you'd probably make a dozen or more, because otherwise it was just a total waste of effort. He also, came up with, things that they might very well have done. Like he waited for a windy night and then tried to channel the wind into the fire to really get it to flame up. And he said, when he became really good at it, you could see, here's a picture of it, you can see the interior of the pots incandesce at different colors depending upon how hot they were, and he really got good at looking like, oh, this is going to be good because it's the perfect color. And he, hypothesized, he was not Native himself, but he hypothesized that this would have probably been a pretty ceremonial or cosmologically important event, that you're creating essentially something out of dirt that's durable and it's glowing, and this probably had some important social and perhaps sacred overtones to it when you're doing this. And you know, my late mentor and colleague Jim Peterson also, you know, among other archaeologists, would take like modeling clay and press into the fragments of this Venet 1 pottery, and then you could peel it off, and you could actually see the positive impressions of this fabric. And I am not very good at this at all, but he could be like, oh, that's a closed, worked twine, double weave, you know. And you, over time, looking at a number of examples, or you know, hundreds of examples, you could actually get and understand sort of the universe of weaving and twining techniques that native people were using. Things that were essentially archaeologically invisible until pottery becomes around, because organically, except under the rarest circumstances, organic materials just don't preserve in Vermont or much of the Northeast soil. So again, really, you know, using innovative techniques and a lot of synthesis of disparate data sets across the region to try to understand things more holistically. All right, I think I'm all right. So another thing that we look at is food and environment, and I'll just go through this quickly. But as many of you know, Vermont has sort of a today has sort of a tripartite forest regime, where you or environmental regime, which is based on altitude principally. This is a paper from Sycamore in 1970, but basically below around 1,800 feet, we have deciduous or mixed forest, where we see the lovely trees turning color and a variety of tree species, and then above about 1,800 feet, we have boreal or coniferous dominated species, and then very at the highest tops of the Green Mountains, we have sort of remnant Arctic tundra. And essentially, in one way to think about it is, if you're hiking up, let's say, Camel's Hump or Mount Mansfield, in a way, you're sort of going through time. You're hiking up through the modern day deciduous forest that populated this region in the last 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, getting up into the coniferous forest that would have been here from 9,000 to about 12,000 years ago, or slowly infilling through time. And then at the top, you're essentially getting what it would have looked like in the early Paleo-Indian period. And it's just something to think about, because native people closer to time, during the woodland period certainly, would have utilized all these landscapes for various reasons and to get various things that they needed or wanted. Just a view from the top of Camel's Hump. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but Charles Cogbill and his colleague Thompson did this remarkable study where they looked at witness trees, which are trees that when in the first lots that were formed in any particular area or most areas of New England, prior to the building of rock walls that really solidified your lot and stuff like that, they would go to the town and say, well, my lot is defined by this particular chestnut tree in this corner of my lot, and this particular tree in the other corner of my lot, and then you would try not to cut those down because they marked your boundaries. And they went through, I think it was 701 colonial townships across New England, and basically just said, oh, this guy said he had a chestnut. This person said he had a maple, and then aggregated all that data to basically understand what the forest cover would have looked like at the first time Europeans laid it out. And what was really interesting is, it's difficult to see in this slide, but as you know, Vermonters of the past cut down the vast majority of their forests in the early mid 1800s for pasture, for farming of various kinds, principally sheep, and then regrew it throughout the late 1800s and 1900s. And what you can see here is this dark red here is beech predominant forests, and then in southern New England, the yellow is oak. And then you can see what's regrown since the late 1800s is just maple dominant all the way through. So what we see is that, here's just a chart of this in Vermont. But what the upshot is the forests that the native people were walking through were not only different in that they were probably much larger and widely spaced trees, but the composition of forests was much different. It was a beech-dominated forest. Fully 36% of the study says that beech is the predominant tree in northern New England, and then maples, spruces going all the way down. And nut-bearing trees, were very much in the minority. Butternut is way down here, and chestnut, particularly in the Vermont area, is very, very rare. So a number of years ago, my colleague Brett and I tried to just do some impressionistic look at what people were eating by looking at analyzing in close detail basically organic remains trapped in fire pits, running it through cheesecloth and fine mesh, covering the tiny bits of charred remains, having them professionally analyzed, and then looking at what they were eating and what they were burning. And these are not statistically calculated. These are more just incidences. But impressionistically, beech does seem to be the predominant wood species being burned in almost every 1,000-year slice from about 5,000 years ago up into European contact. And really interesting, what we learned through this is that organic remains do not preserve after about 5,000 years ago, even if they're burned, only really rarely. We're getting better at looking at more and more microscopic bits of stuff. So we might, through technology, overcome some of this obstacle, but it's preservation is not kind in Vermont. Here are the predominant edible nut species in Vermont that native people utilized. And we can see, again, largely just through incidence, but butternut is by far the predominant species in every 1,000-year time slice. And butternut trees were really rare relative to beech, and yet beech is constantly underrepresented. I'm allergic to nuts, so I've never eaten any nuts, but maybe beech nut is just really gross. I'm sure there's a nutritional aspect to this as well. Butternuts are really high in fat, and particularly during the winter months, fat was really important as a store of energy, and so you can process nuts and render them into oils and other things that you can preserve long term. So I'm sure they were quite important in that way, but it's just interesting to see some of this data. And then cultigens. Through the aggregation of this data, nothing has sort of bucked what we have seen archaeologically, at least since the last 50 years, that corn, beans, and squash really only begin to be grown in Vermont until about 1,000 years ago. So about 1000 AD up until and beyond European contact. But other plants we've seen recently were grown purposely, intentionally prior to that. We have sunflower that was being grown about 2,500 years ago that came out up in Swanton along Route 78. Gourd or squash as well, that was likely edible squash, as opposed to growing them just for containers or fish weights or fish floats, which we know native people utilize. And Chenopodium, or an edible seed, also called goosefoot. So the last period, and we're going to get back to Mount Independence here a little bit, is again this what we call the late woodland period, and defined most notably by the adoption of corn, bean, squash agriculture. And it's interesting that it took so long, or it arrived so late here in Vermont, and in one sense, that might have been because it took a long time to hybridize corn varieties that could grow in this environment. We are right on the edge still today, even with Monsanto and genetic engineering, what can be grown in many parts of Vermont, particularly northern Vermont. And so you needed to hybridize varieties that could stand that short growing season and cold weather. But also, I like to think, or I imagine, and I've seen, try to aggregate data towards this, that people just didn't really want to. I mean, Vermont was a pretty bountiful place to get what you needed through hunter gathering and fishing, and that there needed to be a compelling reason to sort of change what you've been doing for the last 10,000 years, and give over to staying in sedentary villages for at least 3 seasons, planting, harvesting, processing, storing. All this stuff was a radical life way change. And we don't know why they eventually adopted it in 1000 AD or not, but I can imagine that there was some resistance for quite a long time. This is just an early depiction of the Iroquois growing corn. And unlike the Iroquois neighbors to the west, native people in Vermont, as far as we can tell archaeologically thus far, never fully moved into a 4-season village environment. They, as far as we can understand, they got together after corn, bean, squash agriculture became dominant. Many of them, anyway, for 3 seasons, get together in the spring, plant, monitor the harvest, celebrate together, or monitor the crop, then harvest, then store, and then probably break off in the winter into smaller family units. And Pete Thomas, an archaeologist working for a long time in Vermont, came up with this diagram, which might be a little bit hard to read, but basically these are the months of the year: spring, summer, fall, winter, and then the blue is when things were being utilized. So in the spring, shad and salmon runs, and then non-anadromous fish later in the summer, opportunistic nuts and berries and plants. Then in the fall, maize comes in, then deer hunting, then bear, then moose, and around we go. This is a quote that was in an 1828 book by Daniel Clark Sanders, one of the first presidents of UVM, and what he had seen in decades earlier along the Intervale. And just quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but we see one of the biggest archaeological excavations done to date in Vermont was done in advance of the still not built widening of Route 78 in Swanton. This was done over a decade ago. And this is, if you imagine this being over here, this is one long corridor that was tested where the route is going to be expanded. So a very limited corridor along the edges of the existing roadway. And what they found, but very extensive native archaeological deposits. And what the archaeologists found, Northeast Archaeology Research Center, was that this is towards Swanton Village east, and this is west. And what they found is through time, this is the Middle Archaic, so like 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, one little blip, one little spot they found. And then through time, the orange show up a little bit, then yellow gets slightly bigger and further out onto the delta. And then, beginning around 2,000 years ago, the blue, which is what we call the Middle Woodland period, just blows up and sites become very, very dense. A lot of people living there. And then the green is really pushing much farther out into the delta, getting more extensive still, and probably indicates that all of this area was being used as cornfields, and that they were living quite close to the river. Just very dense archaeological deposits. And as Helen talked about, generally deeper is older, the same thing with flood deposits, all other things being equal. All these dark strata are all what we call anthrosols, or human-induced dark soils. And they just go down and down and down and down and down. All different episodes of occupation through time. The first longhouse was found up here on Route 78. It wasn't fully exposed, and in fact, because it was on federal land, the federal government said, well, you can map it, but you can't really dig it. So they took down the plow zone. You can see this line, this post-mold line here, then a turn. This is part of the other one. And then all these in here are fire pits, both inside and outside of the structure. I'll just play this. This is sort of a three-dimensional reconstruction of what it might have looked like. Longhouses were multi-family units, and they were segmented. So each segment, depending upon how long it was how many family units you could fit in there, and they would each have a fire in the middle. Here's the midden or the trash pit related to that longhouse, which is just episode after episode of dumping. Maize remains came out of that, abundant maize, and we got a number of radiocarbon dates from them. Oops, what was that? But also wild rice, butternut, acorn, and a variety of wild plant foods. And a lot of, really extraordinary pottery. And then bringing it back to Mount Independence, what we see up here is quartzite, very common in these late woodland arrow points that called Lavana points. But also this Hathaway chert that outcrops in St. Albans, very near to Swanton, makes some bit of sense. And then I'll just go through very quickly. When we go south, this is on the Intervale. This is just a map of the Intervale, and all of these different colors are the courses of the Winooski River just since 1800. And you can see how much the river's changed. And then these arrows underlying LIDAR point out former river channels. The red are hundreds of years old, and the green are thousands of years old. And all of the archaeological sites we know about in the Intervale, or almost all of them, are along these former river channels. Corncob site, or the Donahue site, is the only intact cob that we've recovered of corn in Vermont thus far, radiocarbon dated to about 1415 AD. And you can see here that there's quartzite again, but then this dark blackish gray chert is this chert that outcrops out at Mount Independence, but also elsewhere, but at Mount Independence. Just quickly going through, this is another one further up the river past the falls in South Burlington, right near the Army National Guard airfields. This is a large excavation that took place about 10 years ago. I was in charge of it. Just go through this quickly. Lots of storage pits. We think that we actually are seeing the side of the longhouse here too, but we didn't find the post molds because the angle that we were excavating was a little bit difficult. We were just excavating where they were going to widen the road. So in regulatory archaeology, we almost always don't excavate where we want to excavate, but where something is going to be disturbed. But nevertheless, a remarkable site. We see storage pits, and then out of 113 of these Lavana type spear points, and here's the distribution of them across this area, 110 were made from quartzite, but the other 3 were made out of this material from down at Mount Independence. Here's a bell-shaped storage feature for storing corn. It's got this characteristic like this. I'm just going to scroll through. Every radiocarbon date came out to 1315 AD or thereabouts. There's an error, but this is a quote from Peter Kalm in 1741. And elsewhere he says, the native people lit those fires to scare up game. But I don't think that's true. I think they were lighting the fires to clear fields for corn. And we had never had evidence until the last 3 or 4 years of actual corn remains in archaeological sites on the Otter Creek. But recent dam relicensing, we found about 4 just on one stretch of the Otter Creek in the Weybridge area. And here's just one of these sites. I won't labor on the intrasite fire pits and features and spatial arrangement. You can see though that this is a very deep sort of bowl-shaped feature. It's sort of layered, probably filled in, or like a refuse pit. Lots of characteristic late woodland pottery in it, but also corn and a variety of other plant foods. But again, getting back to the late woodland, you see, it's difficult to see in this slide, but again, a predominance of quartzite, but only this Mount Independence or southern Champlain Valley chert. And what I've noticed this, not only, these are just a few examples that I could get good slides for, but I've noticed this in almost every site I look at, that below the Lamoille River, there's quartzite and there's this dark Mount Independence chert during the late woodland period, and above the Lamoille River, there's quartzite and there's Hathaway chert. And if everything was totally open and free, and you'd see some amount of Hathaway chert down south. So what I'm thinking is there was some sort of ethnic, territorial, some kind of boundary that roughly demarcated by the Lamoille River. And we're only getting the merest traces of it thus far. I'd like to actually, make this more robust, to look at many more sites and quantify this more regularly, and then look at pottery styles and see if pottery styles are slightly different above and below the Lamoille River. And then we can really get to understand, maybe some of these territorial dynamics, not after European contact when it becomes so prominent and conflictual, but in the centuries prior to European contact and what that might have meant. And I'll leave it there. So thanks. Yeah.
Are roads in Vermont laid down based on ancient trails?
A lot of them are. I mean, the earliest roads, in many cases, yes. Until, about 1850, people start to say, I want my road to go there. And then they just start blasting and cutting and doing whatever they want. Very early on, when the technologies, means, population centers, money wasn't available, yeah, they went through the paths of least resistance, which were very often, former Indian paths, trails. But, it needs to be remembered that the highways of Native people were, the waterways. And you could travel much more efficiently by watercraft than you could through overland trails. So in some cases, these paths were discontinuous in areas where you might not have been able to paddle for whatever reason. But yeah.
And could that begin to address your question about the boundary that the Lamoille created?
No, I mean, it's sort of an arbitrary line. It's just where I see it. I don't think territoriality and sort of identification of place is a big topic in archaeology, and people throughout time and across the world have considered their homeland, their place, to be have certain boundaries or certain extents and identify with certain things, and that changes through time. So I don't think there was any physical impediment why people couldn't go north. In fact, the previous period, I don't see any of that material differentiation. People seem to have been going up and down the lake and going up and down the rivers however they want. Something seems to change, is what I'm just seeing in the archaeological record, beginning around 1000 AD. And again, this is very impressionistic at this point. I've only noticed it in the last year or two as I see more of these big reports coming in, and I'm just like, well, that, it's getting to be where it's not a coincidence. And even more interesting is quartzite is ubiquitous in both. And quartzite outcrops, you can get big boulders of it almost anywhere in the Champlain Valley. But if you really want to go mine a lot of it, you've got to go to the sort of the western spine of Green Mountains, Moncton, Bristol, and then there's a southern belt of it too, Mount Tabor, Dorset. But there's big pre-contact mines in these areas, or exposures, quarries, not mines, quarries. And we don't see any lack of quartzite anywhere. So people seem to have been able to go along the Green Mountains, and get what they needed, but they just don't seem to have been able to go to those quarries, if you're above or below a certain area. So it's a little bit of a, still trying to think that out. Perhaps you could go where you wanted, but you couldn't take stone from one of these other areas. Perhaps, they were protected in some way, they were mythologized in some way, I'm not sure.
Can you tell me about the Heritage Center?
Oh yeah, so the Vermont Archaeology Heritage Center is sort of its principal role is as a curation space for collections derived from archaeological sites that have been excavated in Vermont in a professional way, principally regulatory archaeology, prior to some disturbance. We're rapidly running out of space, but we curate, collections from, over 800 archaeological sites, well over 1 million artifacts. Many of those artifacts aren't things that people would necessarily be interested in, but a lot of them are. And I'm there usually Tuesdays and Thursdays up in Barrie at 60 Washington Street. We have a small amount of exhibit space that actually over this winter my colleagues in VTrans and I want to revamp the exhibits and have some new stuff. So yeah, if you want to send me an email and come up and visit sometime, please do.
So when you go to do your research at the library for the
Oh yeah, I'm in the same
Society?
building.
Same
Yep.
building.
Just come and say hi. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Yeah.
Yeah, Jess, I've heard, in particular in relation to the Mount, that the native peoples, you're talking about the church areas, native peoples worked the edges of the church, and when the whites came in, they started working right in the middle of the church outcroppings. Have you have any comment?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it depends upon the underlying geology. Definitely in other areas. Well, like quartzite. Quartzite is so hard. That you weren't ever gonna, with stone, be able to, delve deep into the stone itself. Develop an adit or a stope to go in and get stuff. You had to work the edges because it was just too hard. But we know of other areas, over in New York, in New Hampshire, where they were, not tens of feet deep, but they were, trying to follow the contours of the best, highest quality, most nappable stone into the stone. I think the part with Mount Independence is that, and perhaps what the Revolutionary War people didn't know, is that this chert is nodular. So you can try to go in as much as you want, but eventually you're going to hit the parent material because it's just bowling ball sized stuff, or big, occasionally bigger. But you could dig as deep as you wanted. You're never going to hit a big vein of it because it's not a chert that's in beds or veins. It's nodular. So yeah, you wanted to expose stuff on the surface. I mean, you didn't want to expend more labor than you needed to. And I have a feeling that thousands of years ago, there was a lot more surface exposure that people were just, expending minimal effort to get out. And then it sort of got played out, and the exposures became more smaller. And then, we do see like little flake scatters, like almost preserved, like someone sat down 1,000 years ago and bashed it off the cliff face and then sat there and made like a biface to transport away right there. We see like almost just the flake scatter around, bigger ones than smaller ones as they're working it down more. We've seen a few of those over the years where just like someone was sitting there yesterday, which is really, really neat. But we haven't seen a lot of, big spalling debris from the Revolutionary War stuff on the church side. So I don't know where, Matt Boulanger and Alan Hathaway, they wrote a paper quite a while back where they found documentation that they were shipping, cartloads of this chert a way to try to make it into gun flints. I doubt it was very successful.
Yeah, there were orders issued to anybody that knows how to map flint, come over here and
Right.
work this church, try to make gun flints out of it.
Yeah.
It's not the best stuff for a gun flint.
No, it's not the best stuff for making spear points either.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a super high grade material, but they were probably psyched to have it relative to quartzite. Quartzite is, once you get it into its shape, it's extremely strong and it maintains an edge for a long time. But getting it into its shape is very, very, from everything that my expert flint effort friends talk about, like most of them, won't even work it anymore because they're like, nope, that gave me, tennis elbow, that gave me carpal tunnel. They just won't do it. So.
Clearly we have to have Jess come back again sometime. I hope you will. So we probably should move on to the next,
Yes.
although I hate that. But thank
No,
you
thank
so
you.
much, Jess. That was just